The Metaverse is emerging as the next big technology platform and promises to be the next frontier for human experiences on the internet. Into the Metaverse covers companies, technologies, and trends that are bringing these promises to life. Join creator and host Jonathan Ross-Friedman, founder and CEO of Supersocial, as he interviews the brilliant minds that are building, shaping, and investing in the Metaverse.
Welcome to Into the Metaverse. I'm Jan, and joining me today is Timoni West, Vice President and General Manager of Digital Twins at Unity. Timoni is responsible for Unity's cloud apps and services in industrial, automotive, commercial, and business markets, delivering value for customers, moving into real-time simulation, reconstruction, and rendering. She runs a P&L with a team of 230 plus people, and prior to that role, she was Vice President of Emerging Tools in Augmented and Virtual Reality, among other things that she's done in her career, which we'll talk about. Timoni, so delighted to have you on Into the Metaverse.
Yes, thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Okay, so let's dig in. Timoni, first and foremost, I like to ask every person who joins the podcast, how do you and or Unity define the overarching theme of the Metaverse?
Yes. So when you look at the different waves of computing over the last century, which is really when computing started to take off post-World War II, there are pretty significant advances that always kind of led to what we then either retroactively or sometimes at the time described as this kind of new wave of computing. So obviously the internet was one example, but I'd also argue that microprocessors and the rise of portable computing is another. So we had, computers that got smaller, they got connected to us, they moved from being in an office into our home, they started being in our pockets, and each of these enables a new class of human-computer interactivity, right? And ubiquitousness and, commoditization and all of that. So when people talk about the metaverse today, the themes that I see that I think are sort of this next wave of change that's really cool and interesting are highly performant GPUs that allow for things like machine learning, sensor information, signal tracking, et cetera, to all happen at scale on these very small portable devices. So that's anything from augmented and virtual reality to robotics to smart home devices. The rise in cheap sensors that can be standardized across the board. So we see like the rise of the IoT standards across devices and across large scale companies. And that means that anyone can go and connect your Hue light to your doorbell, to so on and so forth. So what we're really seeing here is that we're able to ingest massive amounts of data, often real-time data, and then be able to record it, visualize it, or use it to power another device. And I think this has all kind of gotten swept up into what we're calling the metaverse today. But the old school 1970s term was contextual computing, where computers are able to take in contextual information from the world around them and able to do something cool with it. And that goes all the way from, like Star Trek, natural language processing, I'm speaking to my computer, to the robotics of the future.
Interesting. And so for a lot of people who are talking about the metaverse, they like to talk about, I even heard that definition once, which, obviously as someone who's building games and experiences and virtual worlds on platform like Roblox, I can resonate with, which, what if the metaverse is essentially the internet built by game developers? So we're going to talk a little bit about digital twins and industry, but with gaming being such a profound role, at least at the moment, with what people perceive to be the metaverse, how do you think you can help folks better understand the bigger picture of what the metaverse could become?
Well, so for example, yes, absolutely. I think that a subset of the metaverse, if we really want to go metaverse, not just microverse or universe, Roblox is a great example of a really awesomely connected universe. You can be in Roblox and you can go play a variety of different games within the Roblox ecosystem. That's one example. But you can't really leave it, right? It's a destination. It's a place that you go to. When I think about what truly extends beyond any discrete location, be it 3D or augmented or whatever, what I really think about is the data that underpins all of that. So when it comes to a game, your real-time data input tends to be a combination of button presses, maybe some amount of natural language processing around talking to your friends and so on. And that's the reason why it's real-time. In every frame, it can create a new image that seamlessly bind together and they look like animation. This is the power of video games. But the reality is, take away the screen And you have a really similar interaction when you walk into your house and the lights turn on around you. Yeah, you didn't have to push a button necessarily to do it, but there was a physical sensor understanding that there was motion detection coming by. I have one of those smart TVs where the display comes on whenever I walk past, which sometimes I don't want. It's kind of annoying. But the reality is all you've got is here's some real-time, real information. And then I've set it up to trigger some event digitally that can either then go be a game I play, or it could be, unlocking my car. So that to me is the difference between a good example of a really solid world feeling universe metaverse versus the sort of true meta of it all.
And also one of the other things you're saying, which I think is interesting, is that it also doesn't have to be, and quite the opposite, it should not be fully isolated to a virtual place. There should be an interaction with the real world.
Yeah, this really came to the head when I was working in augmented and virtual reality. When you put on a headset, you're wearing basically ski goggles that have micro displays in them, and your eye is like 2 inches away from this micro display and view stereoscopic, so you feel like you're seeing it in 3D. Take that away, you can put on a pair of HoloLens or a Magic Leap, and now you've got a bunch of cameras that are both tracking you and tracking controllers, tracking your hands, tracking the world around you and trying to make sense of it. But what happens when you take off the glasses and you still have the ability to have sensors tracking you? Could be the camera, could be infrared tracking, could be, again, like the motion sensor tracking I mentioned. It doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, to a computer, it's doing the same thing. It still has to hallucinate the world. It still has to track everything. Whether or not you actually see it on a display in front of you doesn't matter to the computer. And the reason this is important to me is because I work at a tooling company for computers. So at the end of the day, it doesn't matter to the Unity engine whether or not it renders something or not. It still has to take it in that input and be able to react to it.
Well, this is a great opportunity to switch gear and dig further into really the world that you're immersed with at the moment for the last couple of years, which is digital twins. And so I know that there's so much confusion, and I personally am constantly trying to understand the distinction between people talking about consumer metaverse, enterprise metaverse, industry metaverse, and everyone has their own definitions now, and there's an omniverse and there's this.
Right, the omniverse. Yes.
Let's take a step back and just what are digital twins in its essence, and how does that relate to quote unquote an industrial metaverse?
So we think of digital twins a couple of different ways. We actually have a maturity model for digital twins, and they get basically from dumb visual representations, which is kind of your classic digital twin, like it looks the same, it feels the same. Maybe it was a real scan of a physical object. And then by the time you get to level 5, which is the highest level of maturity, it is completely in sync with what the real object is doing, or system, or factory, or ecosystem. It's completely in sync. Every amount of live systems data that we can pull in, we have, and it's showing that in real time. But it also can be used to predict the future by simulating this real-time data that it's been recording and to play back prior information. So it can traverse basically your timeline. And that's where it gets really useful beyond just showing you what you could already probably go see somewhere. Places that digital twins are especially useful are places that are hard to get to, places it is dangerous to go, places where it's not immediately obvious when you're there what is necessarily happening. So that's for your visual digital twins. But the reality is a lot of the data, let me be very concrete. When you are pulling in, what I'm trying to think of which example I want to use. We've got airports, we've got factories, we've got stadiums, but
maybe something dangerous.
Yeah, I'll use the Air Force Base, actually. Air Force bases are dangerous anyway. It's not like anyone can just walk in. But with the Trimble Air Force Base, the large part of what they used our technology to do was to figure out how to make sure it did not get knocked down by a hurricane again, because it was knocked down by a hurricane once, and hurricanes are also dangerous. So being able to not only take in the real-time information on the building site as they were building it out, but also be able to use historical data to figure out how to build the right thing in the future is, I think, a pretty great example of a digital twin. That I think, much like the metaverse, though, people naturally want it to look like something. And I don't think that's necessarily always true. I don't think the value is always in just visualizing. The value is having the data accessible, having it standardized, having it sanitized so that it can work together nicely with the rest of your data. And honestly, when we work on digital twins, our Accelerate Solutions team does it a lot. they tell me 90% of the work is just doing the data cleanup to get it to a point where it works together.
So when we think about some of these use cases that you've mentioned, right? It's a place you can't get to, it's a place you want to get to, it's a place that is dangerous, and so on and so forth. A lot of it comes down to not only using the data, but also, okay, how do we simulate things that can tell us something about the future? Like when I think about digital twin, if it's factories, and I'm looking at a lot of interesting examples of what car companies are doing, train companies are trying to forecast what their railroads are going to look like. And so
That's right. Predictive technology.
Exactly. So can you share a bit more about the value of those predictive analytics with regards to the building a digital twin, and what are some of the things that by predicting it, it can actually enable companies to accomplish?
Sure. So predictions can be, it's interesting because the more precise you need to be, the less people tend to trust the simulation, we've learned, as we've been working on simulation.
Can you elaborate on that for a sec?
Yeah. So for example, if Boeing is doing an airflow simulation on a wing, there's no way they're going to take that data and be like, great, we nailed it, one and done. We don't need to test it again in the real world. It's just, I think that's partly because, yes, the data might not be precise enough. Computers are not that accurate yet. But I also think it's because so much can go wrong during the actual manufacturing process that isn't as precise as we would like it to be. And it's hard to measure that until you're actually in the final mile. That being said, it can definitely speed up the process. And speaking of manufacturing, right now we're working on discrete event simulation for spaces. So this allows you to create very quickly, cobble together something that looks like your factory floor, being able to measure input and output, people flow, crowd flow, car flow, automotive flow, robotics that move around, and be able to determine where the roadblocks are, being able to simulate or predict or emulate where the roadblocks will be, and then be able to adjust in advance. So that's actually something that we're working on today. It's pretty easy to use, web-based, and it's to be as accessible as possible so that people can make good decisions instantly. And it's interesting because my PM on the project, Joe Mercado, called that out immediately as the number one problem that we needed to solve. It's not necessarily about the visualization. It's easy to make a visualization. Go hire a 3D artist and go to town. The problem is getting to the point where our data is trustworthy so that people can actually make decisions based on what they see.
So if we think about where we are today and you shoot a dart 5-7 years from now, what do you think are going to be some of the fundamental ways in which digital twins impact industry?
I think a lot of it is going to be unsexy streamlining of like micro improvements, basically. It's, Ford famously came up with the assembly line, right? And that was over 100 years ago at this point. And there were massive innovations in manufacturing and logistics throughout time. Japan famously really was killing it in the 70s and 80s, Toyota and so on. But we are at a point too where the speed and scope, I'm going to stick to manufacturing because that's what we're focused on right now for simulation. The speed and scope of manufacturing has increased so much, how international it is, that having this amount of simulation can really get you to that 0.001% that really makes all the difference. There's also some just big, obvious, glaring issues that people just hadn't thought about. So for example, during COVID, the Los Angeles Port Authority was backed up because this is very early on, they were boycotting ships, not boycotting, but not allowing ships to land in port. And even when they could come in, they were having a delay because at the time, the Port Authority only allowed you to stack 2 containers high. Someone just went in with a helicopter and noticed what was going on. And then they just got a temporary abdication of the law so they could start stacking the containers 4 containers high. And that was it. And that is exactly the kind of thing where a really dead simple simulation could have solved that for you 3 years ago. Right. But you have to have the curiosity and you have to have the tool set around.
And I'm just curious. So what's the level of adoption today that you're seeing, especially as you're talking about manufacturing being such a use case for you guys at the moment? What's the level of adoption and what do you think are some of the barriers for, more companies and industries to adopt the potential of what digital twins can provide for them?
I guess it depends on what you mean by adoption. So when it comes to
adoption would be that companies, companies really integrating digital twin as a, let's say, modality of use to optimize, create, simulate a process and improve their profitability, business performance, talent planning. I mean, it impacts so many things, right?
Yep. Yep. Well, in that case, I was going to say it's probably like 100% because there's not a company in the world that doesn't, well, in the ones that we're talking about specifically around industry. So this would be automotive, transport, manufacturing, logistics, architecture, engineering, construction. They use some different version of this every step of the way. Part of it is going to look completely unsexy and just look like a spreadsheet, but it will be updated and it will be real data. The real interesting inflection point is the rise in better sensor information, more precision, and then being able to apply machine learning to it, right? So that's kind of the next step there. And that tends to be where Unity is finding that we can add significant value, and that is not always adopted at scale across user organizations. That's what I meant by, well, it depends on what you mean by adopted. Yes, everyone does it constantly. Of course, it's part of the job. I mean, architecture had maquettes for years. Would you call that a digital twin? It wasn't digital, but it's still there. So yeah, at what point does it start to go from just a dummy, that's our level 1 maturity level, to level 5?
Well, I think that one of the things you mentioned when we just started talking was that for me is a big distinction, because I think for a lot of people, digital twins at the moment is just, oh, it's like just super high quality virtualization, right? Oh, it just looks like a twin of our real world. But what you're saying, which I think is really interesting, it's really the data, it's the insights, it's the predictive analytics that gives you the ability to plan, and through that essentially, optimize. And I mean, in the industries you talked about, we're talking about massive GDP in every country. I'm curious, are there industries that you think are not part of adoption of digital twins at the moment that you think could have a disruption or negative to that industry?
Interesting. Well, I don't know if I can answer any specific industry being out of it. And like, let me give you an example. For something like healthcare, there's security requirements. There's a lot of different reasons why you wouldn't necessarily want to have a digital twin for specific types of applications for healthcare, but you would certainly want to use digital twin. And we are actually working with a company now that's using our digital twin or our editor and our life systems data technology to simulate flow through in hospitals, for example, right? So it's less about any one specific industry and more about what kinds of applications you need. But yeah, I wouldn't say any industry is immune.
Yeah, because I think what you're saying is also, it's really like when I think about healthcare, it's not like, okay, let's build a digital twin and we'll have some doctor in the form of an avatar that performed the surgery for me. Although, hey, who knows, maybe it could happen.
Maybe, yeah.
But it's more around, okay, if we take a hospital, for example, then it's really how do we optimize the flow? Are people moving in to the right place, to the right direction? And that really doesn't have to do anything specifically with the healthcare use case. It's more just like it's a physical space. I mean, right?
We live in a world where these things are pretty common regardless of industry. This is where I find the term digital, I don't have a better one or I would start using it, but this is where I find the term digital twin can be a little misleading in the same way. I think the term metaverse was misleading, and in the same way, maybe even I always reference the information superhighway. Like if back in the 90s, talking about the information superhighway, it's like I'm on a road and it's a highway and here's this store and here's this store.
And that's Snow Crash, right? It's like you go on a highway and it's basically like it's all there.
Yeah, it's virtual reality. Yeah, exactly. And did that metaphor have anything to do with how people actually experience the web? No, it didn't. And so it fell out of use as people came online and started actually using the products, and they realized it sounded kind of sexy and cool, but it didn't really make a lot of sense. I think the same is probably true of the term metaverse, right? Where the most interesting, the most high potential for revenue, the most practical examples of real world data and computers that can respond to it aren't necessarily going to be happening in a headset, aren't necessarily going to be happening in a game. So we'll see how long we continue to use those phrases as things come online. What I worry about, though, is that people get so excited about the shiny part that they forget the real cool actual change in computing that's happening all around us. Like your phone has a gyroscope. Like, that's crazy. Some phones have barometers, like just massive amounts of sensor information that we're carrying around in our pockets right now that our little tiny computers respond to all the time.
I think that it's very easy to get bogged down with the tech and devices. There is a tendency to look at what is the next big device. Everyone is like, okay, what's past the iPhone, right? And
Sure.
I
Sure,
think
sure, sure.
people forget that it took so long until something like the iPhone came out. Really, it's not about the devices ultimately, because I imagine a world where we're going to be able to access from everywhere, anywhere, all of the time. And it really depends maybe on what is the modality of interaction that will dictate what type of use case fits a certain device. So I'm curious, how do you
Exactly.
think about multi-form factor, modality, vis-a-vis real life, virtual life, and so on and so forth?
Yeah, that's one of my favorite topics. I love talking about IO and different modalities. Actually, I have just uh, kind of an example for you. Although if you go to my website, I have a bunch of different things that I've written about or given talks about it over time. But one thing that one particular type of input comes up time and time again, and it's an odd one. Well, I think it's an odd one. It seems like a very obvious one, and that is voice input to computer. We've seen it since Star Trek. We've seen it in 2001: A Space Odyssey. We've seen it in basically every movie, Jarvis, Iron Man. People talk to their computers and their computers respond. And if you've ever actually tried to talk to your computer, and beyond Siri, which is, all the smart assistants are getting better all the time, you don't interact with your computer that way. You normally tap on it, or you type on it, or you do other things, but you don't do text a lot. And yet people still get really excited about it, especially with this new wave of AI. They're like, oh, I just want to tell my computer to make me, this a video game or movie or scene. And I'm like, what? But it's just this trope that comes over and over again. The upside to it is, in theory, you can just tell a sentence and you get back a million sentences worth of content that hopefully was what you were asking for, hopefully. But the downside is, what if someone's standing next to you also saying, hey Siri, make me a movie? But mine's like a deep space movie. There's lots of downsides to text or to voice as input. It's omnidirectional. You can't opt out of it. It's very easy to misunderstand. It's super annoying if you have to keep repeating yourself, which you do constantly on a computer. You always have to undo, redo, do really repetitive tasks. I mean, you talk to someone who can't hear well and you have to say what a million times. Most annoying thing in the world. So I think there's a little bit of just lack of awareness of how good inputs are for certain classes of communication. But I also think, I actually was looking at this Look Later Man-Human Symbiosis article from 1960, and they were still talking about how all the generals really want voice tech because they don't have to learn to type. So it's one of those things. Humans get kind of stuck on an idea, and then they will just go for it time and time again, a million times over.
Well, I think it's also a bit about the kind of just the fallacy of movies, right? You have on the one hand Hal from Space Odyssey, which is kind of the Freddy Krueger version of scary AI, right? It's just listening to Hal, you're you never want to talk to it. You don't want to hear it. And then you have Jarvis in Iron Man, which is oh my God, I want that buddy with me. It feels like you're talking to a friend. But I think to your point, when I write in ChatGPT, there's a certain interaction and a certain feel when I interact with it, feeling like I'll have and we all have already some smart speakers. And the reality is that this is not a product category that succeeded. Actually, everyone has been selling a lot of product, but I have a dozen of them lying around and no one uses them. My wife hates them. Maybe kids play with it because they think it's cute, but I think at some point you grow up and you're okay, I need some functionality that is useful to my life. Mm-hmm. And again, I think this is exactly what's happening also, I believe, with virtual realities. We're looking at these VR headsets and we're watching a film like Ready Player One, let alone it's a dystopian, horrible film in a world that is ruined.
People miss that part.
And then just want to wear haptic gloves and wear these suits. And I'm trust me, unless you live in a ruined world or in the end of the desert in sub-Saharan Africa, you're probably not going to want to cover yourself 10 hours a day with these haptic. You're going to want something that can interact with your environment. You're going to want to have something where it starts virtually and it extends physically, or it starts physically and it extends virtually. And this is where I really get excited about, however we want to call it, metaverse, digital twins. But I am curious on the digital twins side. When we think about the symbiotic interaction between what's physical and what's virtual, and when you're talking about factories of the future or the way people and humans are flowing around airport or a car manufacturing facility, how do you think, especially with the advent of AI, which is very much like with Ford basically inventing the supply line of making a car, AI will most likely will shape and shift around the way we build things, the way we do stuff.
Oh, 1,000%.
Right.
Yeah.
And so how do you think about AI coming in, virtualization and predictive analytics, and how does that potentially going to impact the future of the workforce within these industries? I know it's a big question, so maybe you can use an example to articulate how you think that could potentially evolve in the next, 5-10 years.
Yeah, that's a great question. I want to take it back a step too, because you're talking about the AI assistants, and I think most people can reasonably say they didn't do what they thought they were going to do. Like you'll say, I'll say, hey Alexa, because I don't have an Alexa device in the room. Hey Alexa, can you play a song on Spotify? And maybe it'll say which song, but you get lost and then you go back to square one. One of the biggest advantages I see today, and one of the things I'm most excited about with this new class of AI chat tools, is that they have entailment. They have the ability to take a thought and continue it down the conversation. It's not like you're resetting every couple of sentences, or you have to figure out or program a bunch of branching narratives. And I think that's truly the difference, right? Like you can have an entire conversation with an AI and it actually stays present and able to reason through the entire conversation. That's a huge step. And I don't know, I don't see people talking about that more. That's really the difference. It's the concept of a kind, useful, smart assistant has existed for a long time, but I think that's the thing that's moved over the hump for that people now find them genuinely useful. It's like, you're talking to something that doesn't have constant short-term memory loss. Imagine the possibilities, right? So, and that's another aspect to contextual computing. Like that is huge. If we're talking about computers able to stay in the context, like that's a genuinely large one. How this affects this huge subset of industry moving forward. I think that one of the things I'm just very practically excited for, and again, I know it doesn't sound as sexy as some of the other examples we could give, is it is going to profoundly improve how quickly we can clean, sanitize, and standardize the data that's coming in from these disparate devices, some of which might have existed since the 70s, some of which are not designed to be able to be used in a live system. Anything from like throughput on an oil, tube, right? Like how many fluid ounces are going by a second? How long does it take? And how compare that to yesterday. To camera feeds, obviously we're already using AI for object human segmentation, clothing, face tracking, body tracking, whatever. That was kind of de rigueur. But being able to use AI to vastly improve the quality and sort of the learnings that we can get out of these products, honestly, that takes away that 90% of the boring part of the business that I was talking about earlier. So that's fantastic. I'm really excited for that. And how much it's going to improve development overall, right? We have, especially at Unity, pretty consistent and massive code bases over the last almost 2 decades that Unity has been around, that we can then use to improve both the speed with which our developers can make products and also the speed with which our internal development team can improve products like the editor.
And when you think about AI, and we're talking about how digital twins can make everything more efficient, more effective, being able to predict the changes. And when you look, for example, at manufacturing, right? There's so many mega trends that are happening with manufacturing at the moment, right? There's automation that has been happening. Now AI is coming in and will probably shape potentially how even supply chain and supply line looks like in factories. Because machines will be smarter. I mean, I remember looking at the first time I've looked at this company, I think that Amazon acquired maybe a decade ago, Kiva Systems. It was the first sort of these robots that were moving things around. And it looked very much like, and I see a lot of use cases now where, using digital twins to simulate what the factory of the future looks like. Are we talking about yet another step change in terms of the way it impacts how these factories will operate? What's the workforce of the future? Are we looking at factories that are really almost like remote controlled, like drones operated today in the military? Is that sort of where potentially we're heading, or?
Long term. In the mean term, that's not what I was as excited about, because we don't really have any robots today that can do basic human level tasks beyond some very highly specialized things, most of which like really relate to transport, picking up, moving things around. There's a pretty good podcast from a few years ago. They were talking about just trying to teach a robot how to fold a towel. It's like a nightmare. There's a number of reasons why that's the case, and we can get better all the time. And I'm sure AI can help improve that sort of like in a beautiful virtuous cycle as well. The part that I thought was interesting is, as you were speaking, thinking about how, man, like smaller scale manufacturing tends to have pretty significant communication issues between the factory and the person who's trying to make something. I had a friend who had like an athletic clothing business that she was trying to make in China. Another friend was trying to make a keyboard, like a really cool ergonomic keyboard. I don't know about you, but I subscribe to any number of very sad, what's the name of the Kickstarter, where you can back different, and they're like, cool, we made this amazing pen. Now we want to go make 1 million of these amazing pens, and just manufacturing at scale is just the saddest thing.
It's actually how my first company was a computer company built around the Raspberry Pi, which we had a 1.5 million on Kickstarter. And then I went to China and built a whole supply chain in Dongguan in the south of Shenzhen. And exactly, it's like, okay, now you actually need to make it real and build it and scale it.
It wasn't easy. Right?
Now.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm curious because I have theories on where I think AI could really help there. But now that like with ChatGPT coming forward, or being able to ignore even like the user-facing side, having computers be able to take in information or reason through and make better decisions perhaps than humans, what would have helped you with that company, do you think?
I mean, just the ability to, first of all, it would help move much faster in understanding what exactly you need to do and how to do, and then filter through the possibilities and ultimately get to a much more optimized decision-making process and understanding what do you need to do, what's the best way, the most effective way, the pros and cons. And, and I had to go and literally discover. I mean, I was walking around factory by factory. That's when I was able to explain to the taxi driver what address I need to go to in Shenzhen, which is a whole story in and of itself. Exactly. But once I arrived there, you're kind of course, today there's more information than, a decade ago or 8 years ago, but still, I think if you can do all of that from the palm of your hand and really deeply understand rapidly, how do you even approach going from a prototype to a mass scaled product that you need to manufacture in a whole new place? It's a step change.
For manufacturing, right, there's different levels of, here's our prototype, and then it goes through different sort of quality gates. I forgot the name of the series, but like it's pretty standard across the board. Like here's number 1, here's number 2, number 3, and then each time you're getting closer to the thing that you're actually going to produce. I was actually thinking material science is an area that could be really cool. What type of rubber should we use? What type of composites should we use? Can we go with, injection molding? Do we need to have custom screws, or can we go with off-the-shelf components? These are decisions that people make every day, and I think they can go really wrong. Like you sort of think it's a solved problem, and then you actually read the problems with.
It does go wrong most of the time, by the way. It does go wrong most of the time, right? Let alone the cultural barriers and all of that. But let's assume you streamline that. Yes, I think the process of manufacturing something at large scale is incredibly complex. I mean, as you said, there's just so many steps. I remember going to Shenzhen and like literally reviewing for like a week different type of packages, what packaging finish we want, what the finish of the keyboard, how does the click sound when you click on it, when you look at companies like Apple, I'm like, you realize like, oh my God, I just made a keyboard that is simple. Imagine what it's like to make the Mac.
Yeah. Exactly. Well, that's where you really have tight partnerships and you streamline a lot of stuff as much as possible over time. And you can do that. You can hire like 1 billion really smart people, and there are ways of doing it that are clever and business-like, but they don't really scale. So getting back to it, when it comes to how I think AI can profoundly help manufacturing, it is helping those smaller independent companies that don't know what they're doing or have a great idea be able to kind of skip ahead and step over all those issues. It's a hope, there's always, the devil is always in the details, but that's where I'm hoping AI can help with, is the details.
And that leads me to another question, which, I think I wanted to get to, which I'm very passionate about because, one of the things all the way from a decade ago when I started my first computer company, it was really about democratizing the power of computing and giving it to young people so they can make the technology they play with, right? And, and then like building now on Roblox, like, I have my company, Super Social, we've got 60 plus people, and they're all like, most of them grew up on the Roblox platform, starting to play as kids, and now they're like builders and creators. And so the thing that I was always excited about technology is that it really unlocks human potential, right? Steve Jobs said a bicycle for the mind, about the computer, and it was always about that. And so when we think about digital twins, and Obviously, there is industry, large companies, Fortune 500, largest enterprises in the world. That's like the bread and butter. Obviously, they're going to do stuff related to that. But when you think about the rest of the world, when you think about the ongoing democratization of technology and putting that in the hands of people, and you just called out with regards to manufacturing, what are the possibilities that you think, 5, 10, 15 years from now are going to be possible for individual small teams in a way that today is absolutely unimaginable?
Going with the small questions, the easy questions. Oh man,
one of the things that I spoke to, for example, with Rev Leberidian, who is from the Omniverse team at NVIDIA, was on the podcast, a year ago, and he gave me his perspective. So I'm curious about your perspective. But one of the things that we've talked and that I believe as well is that when we think about Metaverse, let's say this massive network of interoperable worlds, ultimately there's going to be let's assume the internet is gradually moving into a 3D environment, real-time simulated environment. We're talking about a lot of content that will need to be created and to populate those massive, large-scale, interoperable virtual worlds, right? And so when I think about digital twins in a way that is obviously different, because I'm not thinking about, okay, these consumerized environments where people play, socialize, et cetera, et cetera. However, even in a work environment, if it's factories or things like that, people socialize, they interact, they play.
Right.
Do we think maybe that about digital twins at the moment in a relatively limited, contained way? What's the wild card opportunities of digital twins that at the moment are not kind of on the table from a use case perspective?
So I actually came up with an answer to your other question while you're talking.
Let's go for that then.
Let me speak to that then. The things that we're not going to expect. Unity achieves success by allowing people to make games that otherwise would never have been able to make games. We also allow people who can make a game to make a game faster. But a lot of our really big hits, the special games that never would have been able to make anyway, tend to be really unique, interesting content. But even then, you still have to download Unity. You have to understand what a component is. There's certain ways that you have to work to get to the game working in kind of a conventional sense. When I look at the AI art today, a lot of it is conventional. People will just go in and make a bunch of manga characters or something. It can look fairly generic. The ones that I find really fascinating are the wacky collaborations or it's never truly unique because it's all based on some sort of training data, right? But just wild mixes of things that would almost certainly never have been made at all. Maybe as concept art, maybe one piece of concept art. I think a great example was making the rounds recently was the Harry Potter Balenciaga meme. Did you see this one? Could someone have made that an SNL skit? Maybe. Would they have done it with that level of execution? Absolutely not. Would they have made it at all? Also, possibly. Maybe not. Maybe no one ever would have. I've seen weird 70s movies where everyone's made out of candy, but just the art that is being created today would never have existed through normal channels. But because it's so easy and people can be so specific about what's actually in their heads, they can actually describe it. And I think that's a really interesting thing we're going to unlock over the next 15 years. Taking it back to small independent manufacturers, even today, often they don't achieve the actual vision of what they want to do. Apple being a notable high-end success story there, because they were forced in kind of this conventional mode, because they didn't know what the right words were, because they, ended up just sort of giving up because it was too hard. So that to me is an interesting thing in the next 15 years. I expect we're going to see a huge class of new products that are wacky, but also much closer to what people were trying to make. And that is really exciting as a tool maker, because that's what all we want to do is help people actually make what's in their heads.
Yeah, no, and I can see how that ties to basically, the origins of Unity when it comes to just, game creation, right?
Right.
And unleash. And again, it goes back to that higher purpose of unlocking human potential.
Yeah.
I'm starting to try and imagine what are those wacky ideas that might come, wacky product that might come to life.
I mean, there's all these wacky games, right? What was it called, 3s or 9s or something? It was it was basically a card matching game, but each card was a little monster and they would eat each other, combine to become new monsters. Super cute, super entertaining, super, super creative, but just applying that at scale to, let's go back to the really heavy industry. What is it that, let's say, I don't know, British Petroleum actually would want to see in their workflows and actually do when they can execute without these kind of old tools.
Yeah, I don't know. I have, my wife and I, we have a 2-year-old. I'm still trying to wrap my head around some of the toys for kids. Like, for example, I just saw, and we probably bought it, a lawnmower for like a toy lawnmower that make bubbles. I mean, who came with that idea? Lawnmower as a toy that make bubbles. I'm like, what's wrong with something just to shoot bubbles up to the air? Why do you need a lawnmower? But someone thought about that, and that's kind of wacky.
Right. It is totally wacky, and I love it. Yeah. Yeah. I'm looking forward to that. Let's call it the Wacky Generation. It's
almost like what happened with Kickstarter was just literally like scratching the surface of the level of creativity and human ingenuity that will happen.
Right. That was a platform to get people funded. And the other half, the part, the pain that you went through, was the actually trying to do it and realizing that there was no next step there to help you. Right.
Interesting. Now my entrepreneurial brain is spinning.
Yes. Yes.
So I'm curious about like one thing that we covered so much. And before I go to like a personal question that I want to ask you, when you obviously with Unity, you guys have access to amazing companies, amazing organization that you consider as your customers. When you sit in front, senior executive, chief executive, what are some of the key advices that you give them as a way to think about what is really transpiring at the moment with digital twins and beyond? Just what are the things that you recommend them to think about?
So first, collect as much data as you can in a way that is useful. So this usually involves, especially with these older companies, let's be real, they didn't start out as digital companies. They have made that transformation alongside everyone else from the 70s to the 90s, coming up even till today. And you would not believe how manual some of this stuff still is. They're on the journey. They know what they need to do usually, but they tend to just kind of index on the very obvious types of data when really everything could be something that you could then input into a simulation to that. It's the unknown unknowns, right? Those tend to be the things that you need to focus on most. So that's one piece of advice. And that usually involves, let's come in, let's help you, get everything organized, make sure it's accessible. We have a variety of tools that are designed to help you transform your data more effectively so that you can visualize it. You can view it on across different devices. You can view it in different apps. That's like a huge part of Unity is value prop, interestingly, that I don't think we talk about it enough because people kind of think of it as a solved problem, but interoperability, it's a really big deal. So yeah, that would be probably one of the big ones. Usually by the time they're talking to us, they're already excited about kind of the metaverse-y, digital twinny visualization side. And a lot of times these leaders are fairly visual and do want to see highly complex systems in this ways. So you don't really have to sell them on that part. The part that we do have to explain to them is just the amount of work and the types of data they're going to need.
And also, I mean, there's a whole new generation of senior executive that is in emergence, I would say,
yeah,
right?
More,
kind of the...
Yeah, exactly. They need to do. Yeah. So that's
so
too.
This is a great timing to kind of switch gears completely and talk a bit about something that I'm truly curious about, because looking at your resume, your experience, and your personal story, going from some really iconic companies that are more, internet classic companies, the sort of, some of us would say, Web 2.0 companies, right? Like, so Flickr and Foursquare, where you've been. So I'm curious I'm curious about your journey going from companies like Flickr, like Foursquare, coming into Unity, about 8 years ago. What do you think enabled you to proceed that type of journey? And what got you excited when you started in these companies that still gets you excited today?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So even when I was at Flickr and Foursquare, and I actually had a whole consulting firm, I worked with a variety of social media startups and similar during that time. I tended to work on the things that were like enabling the content, enabling the creation. At Script, I work on the whole editing flow. At Flickr, I redid the whole uploader and lightweight editor. And I really enjoyed the part where we could connect and get people to, see a review and all that. But really, the tooling part was usually the funnest part for me. Not to put myself in a box, but I'm just trying to explain how I ended up at Unity. I got a little disillusioned by that arena by around 2012, 2013. And it was a point where people really hadn't figured out how to monetize other than advertising, which is a problem that still persists today. But most of all, a lot of it was VC backed, and they were really focusing on growth. So you'd have the decision to cut down these really useful, powerful features because only 5% of users use them. And that to my mind was no way to build a quality product. Yes, there's something to be said for simplification, and yes, there's something to be said for having consistent vision, but you're really hamstringing what your product could be over time or moving into a platform if you're only indexing on growth and only indexing on showing higher growth activity. So I was a little disillusioned by it. And so I started thinking deeply about what I did want to work on next. And I was, should I go into healthcare? Should I go into government? And I had a friend actually who was using Unity to make his website and had started getting more interested in the MoGraph and 3D community in New York City, where I was living at the time. And then a former client of mine joined Unity, and Silvio Duran was like, Timoni, you gotta join. It's gonna be amazing. It's so cool. And it really was exactly what I was looking for. I wanted to work on tools that people depended on. I wanted to work on tools that didn't have a compromise, that allowed people to really create something amazing, that weren't just going for activity or lowest common denominator. So it was a pretty easy decision at that time. When I joined, we were talking about, Unity for iPad, Unity for kids. How can we increase the number of people who have access to this? And then when around that time, augmented virtual reality really took off. So then that was my focus for quite a long time at Unity too. But yeah, that was the story. It was really just, I love software. I love computers. I'll always work in computers. And then it was just a matter of figuring out, where do I want to spend my time and effort? And that led me to Unity, where I.
And with that in mind, what's the one thing you want the listeners today to take away from the conversation?
Oh, interesting. I would say when it comes to any new computing paradigm, focus less on the metaphors and more on what the technology can actually do for you.
Sounds excellent. Timoni, thank you so much. This has been so fun.
Yes, of course. Yes, likewise. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of Into the Metaverse. We hope you learned a lot and explored new aspects of the Metaverse.